So this talk is an introduction to the art collection at IWM, and I wanted to, well, discuss with Derek about what we would concentrate on. We're just this one is just focusing on its origins during the First World War, because this is a time when the concept of the war artist first emerged, which I will explore as the talk goes on. It was the first time that there was state patronage of the arts in Britain via the museum itself, which in those days was much more directly related to the government than it is today, and also via government-funded propaganda and memorial schemes. Now, a sizable proportion of these of the fruits of these different schemes, there was quite a few going on, came to the museum too eventually, and this really set the scene for its art collection for the next 100 years. This is what Derek was talking about, this incredibly important modern art collection, which is the kernel really of our art collecting. It all started in the First World War, and hopefully as the talk goes on, you'll see some amazing images that we have. So at its core, it's a world-class collection of British modern art. And it serves to highlight the preoccupations and tastes of the liberal elite in British society in the early 20th century. So it's just sort of going over what I'll be talking about. So this is a quote, "A record and a memorial of the war," from Martin Conway, who was the museum's first Director General. And he was setting out the scope of the museum in 1917. So I'll talk about the foundation of the museum in the context of the First World War, how the art collection came together. It's complex, slightly haphazard in some places, so its own purchases and commissions, and the museum's relationship with the government's war propaganda memorial schemes. And then also talk about the collection themes and legacy, this concept of the war artist, and the purpose of such art at the time, and also within the context of the War Museum. There'll be lots of images. It's a vast collection, so it may feel like a whistle-stop tour in places. This is just the tip of the iceberg, really. We calculated we have around, by the end of the First World War, we collected around 3,500 works of art. Today there are nearly 7,000 works just in the First World War collection alone. The entire the fine art collection at the museum is nearly 17,000 works, and then the wider art collection, which includes things like postcards and reproduction prints and posters, of course very famous, and even the War Artists Archive, that's coming up to 100,000 items. So it's a rich and varied collection. So getting to the foundation of the museum in 1917, of course this was a time when war had been raging for nearly 3 years. 1916, of course, the brutal Battle of the Somme, which had dragged on for months and at huge cost for little gain. And it was the first time that an army of volunteers were sent out from all walks of life. This is a still from the British film, The Battle of the Somme, which was, my colleagues tell me, is the first feature-length documentary ever, which is an incredible thing. We have it here in the museum. And when it was shown in British cinemas, an estimated 20 million people went to see it. They were hoping to catch a glimpse of a loved one. And people in Britain had very little access to information and images of the war. This was tightly controlled. So in 1917, there was really no end in sight of, in this war, and initial optimism had faded. In the 1916 deadly campaign in Gallipoli, it ended in humiliation and evacuation. There were heavy losses at the Battle of Jutland. Of course, there's the Easter Rising in Dublin, started conscription. There were lots of things coming together. So there was also a change at the top at this time. David Lloyd George takes over from Herbert Asquith as Prime Minister. He's highly aware of the public's disillusionment and sets about revamping government. And he's creating a small war cabinet, new ministries, and he appoints Sir Alfred Mond as the first Commissioner of Works, responsible for public buildings and monuments, and he's one of these sort of energetic individuals who Lloyd George appoints. Now, it's Mon that proposes the a national war museum. He was inspired by 2 letters by people who had written to the Times, an influential paper at the time, who had the same idea. Mon's quite interesting because he's the closest you get to an outsider in politics at the time. Of course, many politicians are aristocrats at the time. He was the son of German Jewish immigrants, they'd done very well for themselves, but still he endured both anti-German sentiment, of course, and open and casual anti-Semitism, widespread in society at the time. So in some ways he's an unlikely founder of our museum on the face of it, but he could see that a national collection of objects representing people's contribution to the war would be an official recognition of their sacrifice, and the idea was to reassure people that their efforts weren't in vain. And the War Cabinet agreed, and they gave him an initial budget of £3,000 to start collecting. So it's a very early photograph here from our history. Its first collecting started, they had a store at Édin in France in March 1917. It gives you an idea of what they were collecting off the battlefields. This idea of by creating a museum during the war itself, or not waiting until it ended, they could collect material from the battlefields that would otherwise be lost. Things like wireless sets, guns, ammunition, helmets, flags. The same was true for art as well. Art that otherwise might have been lost to collectors. And there was a great interest in war art by 1917, many exhibitions. The museum had a system of various themed committees. There was Admiralty Committee, Munitions Committee, Library, Women's Work Committee, and these kind of grew and evolved as time went on. And it was the Dominions and India Committee which petitioned for the change of name very early on. It becomes the Imperial War Museum because of their idea. So the title remains to this day is the IWM. It stands for the Imperial War Museums now, because we, as we like to put it, we're a family of 5 branches. There've been many debates over the years, of course, about keeping the name. But nowadays we see that the use of the word imperial is taken as a nod to the museum's history. It stands for the sort of global scope of the museum. We like to put that forward now. Our ambition to represent the wartime contribution of the whole of Britain's former empire, the Commonwealth. And clearly, there's a long way to go. It probably meant something slightly different back then. Of course, in the early 20th century, Britain was not only a deeply hierarchical society in terms of class, but the theories of the importance of race in determining intelligence and fitness were gaining momentum, this branch of pseudoscience known as eugenics. So the Dominions and India Committee, Dominions were the white-dominated settler territories in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa, which were self-governing junior members of the international community at that time. And India itself was also on a path to Dominion status, self-governance at this time. And the Indian Army, of course, represented a unique place for Britain. It was huge and professional, and it came along to fight alongside the British in 1914, when there was only a very small professional British Army in France and Belgium. So by the end of the war, 1.5 million Indians fought and laboured for the British. So the memo on the scope of the museum in June 1917 that Conway wrote to Mond goes as follows. The committee understands that the end to be achieved is the provision of a record and memorial of the war by sea and land in all parts of the world, of the raising, equipment and transportation of armies, of munition manufacture at home and elsewhere, of the medical and other subsidiary services of the work of women, both directly for war purposes and indirectly by substitution, and generally of all activities called forth by the war at home, in the Dominions and in India, at all the fronts and on the sea. So you can see the focus right there from the start. It didn't set out explicitly to include the colonies across Africa, Caribbean, elsewhere, rest of Southeast Asia, for example. So it did have an angle that was very much of its time, but of course, even with that, the museum's collecting remit was vast and limitless, given the all-encompassing nature of the war. And also, having said this, the Dominions and India Committee was not particularly interested in collecting art. Their focus really was on uniforms, all the different types of uniforms. So that's another story. But moving back to so I focused to the art, it was the art collecting was really from a British perspective from the start. Right. So art collecting was not centralised through these various committees. It could be a bit disjointed. And the museum's leaders were art enthusiasts, and there were different competing voices going on. But it did have a clear, defined purpose. Like everything the museum collected, it had to be a kind of historical record. So it might seem a bit strange to think of art in this way, subjective business. But the idea was that the artist had to observe the scene depicted. So coming back to this idea of the war artist. And IWM's principle of the artist as eyewitness, it was perceived as critical to its mission and brand, and it would remain so for at least the next 70 years. So here are some examples of some early purchases and gifts to the museum which fall into this category. We've got Nico Jungmann, who was a civilian who'd recently been released from Ruben prison camp, probably not pronounced that right, and near Berlin. And he made a series of works in tempera of scenes there, and put them on display in London, where the museum bought some. And 8 drawings by Harold Williamson, who he had trained at the Royal Academy and then served in the King's Royal Rifle Corps on the Western Front, where he was wounded and hospitalised. And then after that, he made these works in these sort of staged, poised, had dreamlike quality. These works and quite striking. Walter Bayes. This may be one you know. There's a huge painting entitled "The Underworld," which it currently hangs in our atrium near the information desk on level 0. Was Elephant and Castle Tube, and it's sort of done in a history painting style, and it showed the new phenomenon of people sheltering in the underground during air raids. It did happen during the First World War also. And then we also have Charles Burley's interior of the pavilion at Brighton. And he painted the wounded Indian soldiers who were being treated inside the pavilion. The idea was they'd feel at home there. It was also a great PR exercise to publicise back in India, to say we are treating these troops particularly well, which is what they did. But there were exceptions to this sort of eyewitness principle from the start. I found these recently. So Alfred Mond was an avid collector in many London art world connections, and he donated 3 etchings by the artist on the left, Jules de Breiker, who had fled the violence in Belgium at the start of the war. And it's maybe a bit dark on your screens, I don't know if you can see, but at the top there's the monumental figure of death, and he used that to sort of represent the brutality of the German attacks on civilians. And clearly Mond was not too worried about de Breiker having literally witnessed the scene, but he perhaps sense a different kind of authenticity, the corroborating account by a Belgian artist, stories emerging from Belgium at the start of the war, and these accounts were served as powerful propaganda for the British in sort of gaining support from the war, characterising Germans as savage and rallying people in support of the war. And then similarly, Ian Malcolm MP, who's one of the Times letter writers, he ended up chairing the art committee. He donated this drawing by Widhopf, and this is a widely propagated story of a Canadian soldier who was crucified by the Germans. And this is a similar kind of made up kind of thing. I don't think it was ever. We don't know how true the story is, as we say, but certainly there wasn't that vision of Jesus there. So art had a role to play really in representing societal attitudes and the cultural impact of the war, how war is waged by information and images. And that's still an important theme for the museum, about explaining the strong sway of propaganda. There's a bit of a contrast here. So then IWM did start, as well as collecting, it started commissioning, and its first commissioned artist to be sent to the Western Front was Adrian Hill. And previously he'd served as a private in the Royal Artillery in France before he was invalided out. And the drawings came to the attention of Charles Fuchs, who was the first curator, the principal curator of the museum. What we have here are works that are understated and restrained, and Adrian was commissioned to document ruined churches, villages, gun and tank workshops, stretcher parties, captured enemy guns, and abandoned battlefields. And he made around 187 drawings in about a year. And this quote here is interesting, as Fuchs asked for more uninteresting technical drawings. This real idea that art could act as a sober sort of record. But also, the museum's model makers were basing their models on Hill's drawings, so that was another reason for them to be this sort of rather sort of sober style. And this idea that only someone who had served and observed the war firsthand could truly articulate the war in their work was here. And there was a precedent in terms of Muirhead Bone on the right, who was the first artist chosen by Wellington House in 1916. So we talk about Muirhead Bone being the first official war artist, really. Wellington House was a secret branch of the Foreign Office responsible for propaganda aimed at neutral and allied countries. And the idea was that Bone's drawings would appear as illustrations accompanying news and opinion in seemingly independent publications. It wasn't obvious that the government were behind these publications. They often did these with the help of Country Life, and then produced publications such as the Western Front, British artists at the front as well. So it's this subtle but effective approach to propaganda marked the start of Britain's tradition of official war art and the birth of the war artist, really. And there's been more on Bone later, who's an important patron of the museum. So at around the time the museum was founded, Lloyd George established the Department of Information in February 1917. And this was the thing that really got things moving in terms of interesting war art. And it was understood that the propaganda was needed at home too, a visual propaganda. And of course, we'll talk about the importance of the public mood when it was really hanging in the balance. So an arts commissioning program was started then. And this was a new role for artists in wartime, particularly those young enough to have served. They really felt that a new type of art was needed. Both Nevinson and Nash were young artists. They'd previously served at the front, Nash as a soldier, and returned home and quickly exhibited works that based on their experiences at the front. And they really got a lot of attention from this. And people saw it, because people didn't have access to many images, they really saw this as a sort of truthful vision, this modern art. And it was very bold, actually, of the Department of Information to commission Nevinson first in April 1917, Nash later that year. But it's obviously at the point of general disillusionment with the war, and both artists articulated war weariness in their different ways. So for Nevinson, he underwent a huge change. Previously he'd made avant-garde futurist work, and then when he went to the front, he changed. He thought this crude realism that was all his own really was much more appropriate, and he had a focus on the common soldier, which meant he maintained his popularity. But this example was censored because, of course, the Department of Information wouldn't allow depiction of dead British servicemen during the war. Nevinson instead, when he had his exhibition, he did hang it, but with them covered in brown paper with the word censored across the front, and obviously got a lot of mileage from a publicity stunt. He was good at that sort of thing. But Nash's work was often focused on the war-ravaged landscape as a sort of romantic metaphor for the ravaged national body, and it baffled many people. Actually, baffled the censor. That was funny tree pictures. What's everyone worried about? But it crucially impressed and fascinated an influential circle, the Britain's liberal elite, people who were leaning towards pacifism and who might have been put off by more sort of crude, obvious sort of propaganda. And these people were influential. So they, this painting, "We Are Making a New World," that's very well known now as an anti-war image, was actually an official propaganda image. And both these works of art carry ironic titles of "Paths of Glory," "We Are Making a New World." Propaganda's appeal is not appearing to be propaganda. That's how it works. It's not obvious propaganda. So I'm just checking the time here. No idea how I'm doing. Right. The other Department of Information artists, there are a few of those as well. So we have Eric Kennington, who was another soldier artist, another artist that served, and he portrayed the men as noble. We have also William Orpen, who was a huge celebrity at the time, who highly successful portrait society artist. He saw these young artists going out to the front. They only went out for a few weeks. He wanted to get in on some of that action because, you know, maybe his career had been stagnating for a while. It's rather safe material. He wanted to get out there to France, and he did. He stayed out there for years. He pulled some strings to get there. And it seems like his trip was a revelation, and he made this series of modern allegories reflecting the fragility of human existence and the madness of war. His art drew on the past rather than was modern. He was criticized. Not everyone really got it. They thought it was a bit staged. Maybe there's some of his paintings looked a bit like some of his old paintings, but he wasn't interested in trying to be realistic. He's an important artist for the museum, in that he donated his entire wartime output to the nation, and that eventually ended up being the museum. So and we have the Orpen boardroom today. We have some of his works up in there. And then there's also McBay, who was sent around the Middle East. He was primarily an etcher, who's self-taught. He went to Egypt and Palestine, and he made nearly 300 drawings. Sorry, I'm on my own, so the lights have gone off. So I have to just stand up and wait. There we go. The lights are on again. It'd be a bit strange me sitting in the dark, wouldn't it? So yes, McBay's collection of around 300 drawings that he made as a Department of Information artist document the last days of the Ottoman Empire. So they're really fascinating from that point of view. But the Department of Information didn't collect their works. They were just needed for reproduction. So many of these works went to the British Museum, but the IWM did manage to get hold of some later. So I hope everyone's keeping up. The Department of Information, now the Ministry of Information, March 1918. So it just got bigger, and then it was responsible for all sorts of communication at this point: films, press, photographs, censorship. It all came under one ministry. And the government chose Lord Beaverbrook, the press tycoon, to head it up. He was the first Minister of Information. It was important to keep the press on side, and he was immensely powerful. He was also an early advocate of war art. He came from Canada, and he had founded the Canadian War Memorials Scheme in 1916, and they commissioned Canadian and British artists to make these large-scale paintings that articulated the war from this new nation's point of view. And he set about doing the same thing for Britain, creating the British War Memorials Committee in 1918. And this was kind of indicative of this wider mood of reflection that had resulted following the forming of the IWM. Obviously, the war was still going at this point, but there was a lot of looking back over what had happened and how are we going to remember this war. It's not going to go on forever. How do we commemorate people's efforts, their sacrifice, that sort of thing. Now, what's interesting about the the British War Memorials Project, it engaged the spectrum of British art. I've listed some of the artists involved here. So we have this sort of older, traditional, academic painters. We kind of talk about them as, and the young, modern avant-garde. And again, but their works had to be based on actual experience. But these paintings, which are now some of the most famous in our collection, were never intended originally for the IWM. There was a plan for this Grand Hall of Remembrance, specially built to contain paintings and sculpture when the war ended. But of course, funds, momentum, the will ran out. No one wanted to be thinking of these things when the war did actually end. And the completed pictures came to the museum, which was a real coup for the museum. So, yes. So when the museum took on the administration of the scheme in the end of 1918 and 1919, many of the works were unfinished. And actually at the time, not everyone at the museum was completely convinced. So an example of some of the young avant-garde painters who had made a work for this scheme was Wyndham Lewis. And he had an exhibition in early 1919, and I found minutes of the IWM Art Committee from this time. Mr. Cook mentioned he had been to the Goupil Gallery and had seen without enthusiasm the drawings by Lieutenant Wyndham Lewis. Now, Herbert Cook was an art historian of the Italian Renaissance period, and Wyndham Lewis, young avant-garde painter, leader of the short-lived Vorticist movement. He had served as a bombardier at the Third Battle of Ypres. So these were based on his experiences. And he has the officers in the foreground, and in the background is these rather sort of mechanistic figures that conveyed exhaustion, apathy, and they may not have been what the IWM at the time were really looking for. However, this painting, of course, is one of the memorial paintings and arrived at the museum later that year. And other artists, were dropped at this time. For example, Flora Lyon, and in end of 1918, 1919, she was the only woman left on this scheme. Anna Airy and Dorothy Cope had dropped out earlier on, and IWM decided not to purchase her works. Lyon was a portrait painter, and this work, Women's Canteen, portrays the women workers as confident and liberated. They're quite powerfully posed, if exhausted too, actually. This did later come to the museum. The artist donated this one and another painting to the museum in the late 20s. So what was the museum looking for? Well, it depended on the committee, actually. So we have the Admiralty Committee. It took the business of commissioning art very seriously, consulted specialists at the V&A and the Tate, and it's built. I mean, there was a rich tradition of naval art by this point. So I've put a couple of examples here. We have Charles Pears and Norman Wilkinson, different dazzled ships. Of course, Norman Wilkinson was the inventor of the dazzled scheme. It's another story, of course. And the Air Force Committee that was founded in April 1918 after the founding of the RAF. They were looking for sort of a technical romantics of idealized art to promote this newest armed service. It was real aviation, even in the context of wartime, is a profoundly romantic subject, and really marks the birth of aviation art. All their artists had to be serving in the RAF, and they chose Richard Carline, who was only 21 and partway through his art studies at the beginning of the war, to lead a group of aero artists. And Carline and his brother Sidney produced a number of groundbreaking studies drawn from the cockpit of a plane, which they worked up into paintings, and they went to France, Italy, and the Middle East to make these works. But it seems the committee were frustrated with the Carlines' work. They felt they were focusing too much on a dizzying landscape, not enough on the aircraft themselves, and they commissioned a plethora of other artists, including Norman Arnold, and Stuart Reed here, who made constructed scenes. So there's often a sort of a celebration of pure spectacle, daring do. And Reed here, he had served in the Middle East, but this had been reconstructed later. So this was more sort of in the old style of war art, battle art, where you use models, you work, and you know any items that come from the battlefield, and you put them together and you construct an image. So it's not strictly eyewitness, of course, but maybe more what they were looking for in terms of the imagery itself. And now in the area of representation of women, the museum was more forward-thinking than any of the government schemes. It had a committee dedicated to recording women's work during the war. And also the munitions committee commissioned Anna Airy, who had trained in the Slade, and she's one of the leading academic painters of her day. She made 4 paintings for them, which we have. Her contract, though, with the museum was unusually strict. It was signed by Alfred Mond himself, and it had a clause about she should die mid-commission, because these were dangerous places. The IWM had a right to purchase, employ another artist to finish off her work. But despite all this, this was a very successful commission, and which, in contrast to her previous commission with the War Memorials Committee, which just didn't. She was so upset with her work that they'd rejected, she decided to destroy it. So yes, at least ended well with this particular commission. And the Women's Work Committee were about recording the different new roles for women. So we have Victoria Monkhouse, who was drawing them, bus conductors, postwomen, ticket collectors, window cleaner in this instance. Agnes Conway, who was the daughter of the Director General and the Secretary of the Committee, said each drawing ought to be typical of the profession and not a mere fashion plate of the uniform with an ordinary dolly face. But they were very happy with her work. It was seen as rather dutiful and genteel. But it took time. Women were busy. They didn't have time to sit necessarily for their portraits. And Lady Norman was the chair of the committee. She was a suffragist, and she wanted to commemorate the many women involved in medical work as well. That was an important focus. Nora Nielsen Gray had served as a nursing orderly in the Scottish Women's Hospital, and women doctors were unusual, and they served away from the front lines. They wanted to celebrate, in particular, the work of Dr. Frances Ivans here. And there was also John Lavery, had many different war artist assignments. He was completely prolific with the Department of Information, the IWM Admiralty Committee, and the Women's Work Committee. So we have his work that he made for women's work. It was after the end of the war. Another strand of collecting was the medical artists, producing work for a new Army Medical War Museum. They were based in studios in Fulham, and this is another project that didn't materialise. But the 1918 report from the museum said about their work: all the models and the works of art have been produced by artists who have seen actual service in France and have obtained the data for their work firsthand. I thought this was rather scientific language, data. It kind of obscured that they were mainly working for models and equipment in the studio. All of these artists served the RAMC, the Royal Army Medical Corps, but this didn't mean they were actually made it out of Britain at any point, and until they were commissioned as artists. And these medical works were displayed at the Crystal Palace in 1920 when the museum first opened. By then, the momentum for the Army Medical War Museum had been lost. Many of their works ended up with the IWM, the Wellcome Collection, and other military hospitals as well. Ironically, Austin Spare on the right here was praised for his grisly truthfulness. In the Times review of the exhibition in August 1920, Despite he had never visited the battlefields, his work was mainly derived from photographs. Rogers on the left was the leader of the medical war artists, and these are really disturbing works, but they sort of reflect a post-war appetite to confront the horror. You know, now the ban on depictions of dead servicemen had been lifted, and also helped to create this image of the muddy battlefields we so associate with the First World War. So, getting back to Muirhead Bone, if you remember, he was the first commissioned war artist by Wellington House, and now he was involved. He was involved very much with the museum and the British War Memorials Committee, and he established the Bone Fund in 1918. And he was an important patron for the museum. He very enthusiastically supported young modern artists. His taste was very different from his own work. And he's actually sold a lot of his own work, and he didn't want to be seen to be profiting from the war, so that's why he funneled the funds back to purchase art for the public. He was concerned that a conventional military taste was dominating the museum's collecting at this time, as funds were running out as well, and he had complete control of his Bone Fund, and he even commissioned artists. So it's sometimes interesting which commissions didn't materialize. So Jakob Epstein is a good example. Bone bought the tin hat for the museum, but the museum had tried and failed to commission Epstein earlier in the war. After they'd sent Adrian Hill to the Western Front, Conway, the Director General, was very keen to engage Epstein, and this is when he'd first displayed this sculpture, the tin hat, and it gained a lot of attention. And it was a really new idea back then to show a sort of everyman, someone who was weary, relatable, not someone who was part of the elite, you know. But what was interesting was that Epstein had made a stylistic change in his work. His work previous to this was really angular, robotic, modern. So when making this work, he was aiming it at a particular audience. He really wanted to get a war artist commission. He didn't want to go and be called up, you know. So so Conway thought, yes, it'd be a great idea. We could have sculpture too. We can send Epstein out to the front to make a series, and I quote, make a series of typical heads of private soldiers serving in the various contingents that make up the British Army. And then he added, though much of his work is of a character I personally do not like, his ability is unquestioned, and his suitability for the type of work above indicated would be universally admitted. So he's admitting he's a bit of a controversial sculptor. I think the War Cabinet were they weren't quite convinced that he needed to go out to the front to do this work. So Conway writes another letter, and I quote, we want type heads of the many groups of men employed in the war, in front and behind, Jews, Turks, infidels, heretics, and all the rest. So this language may seem a bit outdated now, but it reflects the sort of the Western Front as a sort of uniquely cosmopolitan place that it was at the time, and I think Conway, you know, he was a progressive in his time. This was his attempt at what we would call diversity today, I suppose. Of course, it was types, not individuals, which is very much a sort of the way of thinking of the time. But this commission never materialized, and it was not because of anything to do with the ideas behind it, but it was because of Epstein being controversial. 10 years earlier, he had made nude statues for the British Medical Association building, and they had offended the sensibilities of British society a lot, so much. So he was already a controversial sculptor, but also there was another sculptor, George Frampton, who really had taken against him, and it seems that he wrote to Conway and and we don't know what he said. So we know this letter has been removed from the file. We don't know exactly what he said, but we know that he did campaign for German artists to be removed from artistic societies, and it's possible. So Epstein's a Jewish artist originally from America. He did become a naturalized British citizen, but it's possible that Frampton did object on those grounds as well. So, but thankfully we do have his work, because Muirhead Bone bought the Tin Hat and a few other sculptures afterwards. Dorothy Coke, as I mentioned before, she'd almost managed to get a commission for the British War Memorials Committee, but they decided to turn her down in the end. She's a very young artist, only 21, but Bone saw her potential, and she portrays the women. It's quite a modern sort of looking scene. The women are in fashionable clothes. They look very relaxed and in control. Of course, they're helping the men who have been invalided, and they're marked by their blue uniforms. It's the men that are more marginal in this scene. And also wanted to show briefly these works by William Roberts and Neville Lewis are just other stunning examples of works collected by Bone for the IWM. So lots of these war works were exhibited after the war, and one of the key exhibitions hotly anticipated was the Nation's War Paintings exhibition at the Royal Academy, December 1919 to February 1920, and all these mixtures of styles that I've been mentioning was presented in this exhibition, with a lot of the modern styles up front, but unfortunately they provoked a hostile reaction from the press and from other parts of society too. Some of the headlines: "Heroes made to look like clowns," referring to this work by Nevinson. They thought it was rather too crude of the soldiers. And there was even a question in Parliament about the freak pictures. Talk of Bolshevism in art, the right-wing press equating progressive art with a sort of threat to social order. And this criticism really unnerved the IWM, and particularly Alfred Mond. Perhaps he could sense an undercurrent of anti-Semitism, and this idea of modern art wasn't suitable for memorial painting. And there actually had been a campaign for a picture gallery leading up to this exhibition, and that just faded away. Mond was keen to prove that he was a very patriotic man. And when he was asked about these freak pictures in Parliament, he distanced the museum from the work of the British War Memorials Committee. Some of the most extreme artworks went on long-term loan to the Tate Gallery. Wyndham Lewis, Stanley Spencer. So leaving works, in particular like Gast, in pride of place at the museum. When these are the galleries at the Crystal Palace, which opened in 1920. We have some of the original museum displays shown here. The Crystal Palace had been a popular Victorian theme park, but its glory days were well past. IWM was not initially keen, but was really stuck for a home at first, and they couldn't resist a cheap 3-year lease. But it was more like a greenhouse. It really wasn't appropriate. And yes, I think I would say Gast is still IWM's most popular, recognizable painting. The temporarily blinded soldiers being led to treatment and safety still resonates with people, and temporarily blinded, of course, by mustard gas. And it's a redemptive scene, and it's a forlorn sight, but it's so beautifully painted. There's still optimism, and the light that's in the painting, and the football game being played in the background. This sort of alludes to this sense of there is recovery, things will be better again. And it really did chime with the museum's central narrative of a necessary conflict fought for a more peaceful future. And then the last photograph shows the cavernous interior of the, it did suit housing these massive guns. But did risk also glorifying the destructiveness of modern war. It's always a conundrum the museum faces. After that, the museum moved to the Imperial Institute in South Kensington in 1924, and it was there for 11 years. It really had to seriously downsize. It was only a couple of rooms there. So we do continue to collect. There was a long lull due to funding, but really collecting started again in the 1970s, really, on the First World War. And by that time, the museum was also covering the Second World War and other conflicts involving Britain and the Commonwealth since 1914. And the museum also had moved to its Lambeth Road site where I am today in 1936. And it set about expanding the building in the 1960s. So just a couple of examples to finish on. Eric Kensington's at Laventie came to the museum in the early 80s, and it was the work that first got Kennington noticed in 1916. It's arguably the first piece of soldier art seen by the British public, and it's actually the Department of Information thought it was too frank at first, but it's an incredible tribute to his battalion, painted on glass from behind. So you have to start with the details first and work your way back. So incredibly difficult technically to achieve. But it was a new way of portraying the soldiers. He saw them as both weary and noble. And then on the right we have Tipperary by Walter Sickert. This was acquired in 2021 with the help of the Art Fund and National Heritage Memorial Fund. Today we want to tell the story of the war schemes and what was happening at this time in terms of state patronage, propaganda, memorial, but we also wish to highlight artists who were not involved with any of this. And Sickert actually turned down a British War Memorials Commission, which is very unusual, but he was always bucked the trends, I guess. And so these artists who were reacting to war for their own reasons. This is typically ambiguous, and there are layers of meaning in this. He's used an unusual compositional device of a large mirror to create this interesting juxtaposition of the soldier in the sunshine and the woman pianist sitting in the gloomy interior. We can't see her face. And, you know, adding the title Tipperary adds another layer to its interpretation. This is a very popular song written just before the war, but it was reportedly sung by the troops right at the start of the war. There was an article about this in the Daily Mail and printed all the lyrics, and it became very, very popular. It's a long, long way to Tipperary. It was a real hit. So, you know, even an artist like Sickert, he was caught up with, or he was at least capturing the sort of war fever at the time and proving his patriotism as well. He was born in Munich, so he was quite keen to prove that. And also, it's an important acquisition for us because the early part of the war is hardly covered, as these official war schemes started much later in the war. So to conclude, attention has always existed at the heart of the museum between the urge to try and represent historical narrative in a dispassionate way and reconciling that with the question of the role of art within the History Museum. Art is a subjective enterprise, so it is a surprising choice as a sober record of war events. By quietly allowing some flexibility towards its art acquisition policy from the very start, the museum acknowledges that the role of its artworks is manifold. They tell us about the preoccupations not only of the individual artists, but of the society and climate in which they operated. So for First World War works, obviously the context of the total war. They help us understand the context in which they were brought about, who the commissioners were, the intended audience. However, the most successful artworks, of course, defy their context and continue to speak to audiences today, 100 years plus on the universal themes of war and the human condition. So thinking particularly Gast and We Are Making a New World by Paul Nash. But the concept of the war artist as a term perhaps has become less useful over the years, as the term is so closely related to this idea of a soldier artist sent out to paint the Western Front, and cannot easily be translated to the complex nature of conflicts today. And it is very difficult to get an artist into the conflict zone nowadays. Although IWM, like many other museums, has been making noises in regard to addressing the legacy of colonialism, there's still much work to do. Without beginning to properly confront the colonial context in which the museum was founded and its legacy, the museum will continue to alienate a great deal of its potential audiences. Today, IWM operates in a political climate where investigation and discussion of Britain's colonial past is increasingly controversial and polarised. In this respect, the museum finds itself in a similar position to that of Alfred Mond, following the Royal Academy's Nations Painting Show in 1919, nervous of criticism, not wanting to appear unpatriotic, and keen to maintain a kind of mythical impartiality. Thank you. That's it from me.